And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we're presenting the theme, Media, News, and Ethics in the Digital Age. Our distinguished guests today are James Fallows and Michael Gerson. James Fallows, who is serving as our moderator through this week, is a national correspondent for The Atlantic, co-creator with his wife Deborah of the publication's American Futures Project. Through that project, in partnership with Marketplace, the Fallows travel the country reporting on the people, organizations, and ideas reshaping the country. They have just completed a book based on their travels for publication in 2017. James Fallows has written for The Atlantic since the late 1970s, living and reporting in Seattle, Berkeley, Austin, Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai, and Beijing. He is currently based in Washington, D.C. In addition to working for The Atlantic, Fallows spent 2 years as a chief White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter and 2 years as the editor of U.S. News and World Report. He has won the National Magazine Award and the American Book Award, among other recognitions, and a New York Emmy Award for the documentary series Doing Business in China. Founding chairman of the New America Foundation and a frequent public radio commentator, James Fallows is the author of 11 books, including National Defense, Breaking the News, Blind into Baghdad, and 2 books based from China, Postcards from Tomorrow Square and China Airborne. Jim will introduce Michael Gerson, whose presentation will focus on the 5 things everyone should know about politics in the age of Trump. And then they will engage in conversation about Michael's remarks. You'll be pleased to know that Michael will be doing a book signing immediately after this lecture on the porch of the Hall of Missions, and that his book will be sold there as well. I'm pleased to acknowledge that I used Michael's wonderful book, City of Man, in a course I taught on faith and politics at Emory University. Delighted to see him again here today. You'll also be pleased to know that Jim will be doing a book signing at 12:15 on Tuesday in the Author's Alcove next to the bookstore. We're grateful to the Susan Hurt Hagen Lectures Fund and Thomas B. Hagen for support of James Fallows' presence at Chautauqua this week. We're grateful to the Elizabeth Elser Doolittle Endowment Fund for adult programming for providing funding for all Week 8 Interfaith lectures. The Department of Religion is greatly pleased to welcome both Jim and Michael to this podium, so please join me in providing a very warm welcome to Jim Fallows.
Thank you so much, Robert Franklin, for that gracious introduction. Thank you to Maureen Ravegno and your colleagues in the Department of Religion. Thanks to the Chautauqua Institution, its new President Hill, whom we met last night, to Tom Hagen and his family for underwriting this process, and to all of you here for coming to the Hall of Philosophy on this afternoon. Are you having trouble hearing? Okay, so I was giving the thanks. So the thanks, I'll go through the thanks more quickly. I was thanking everybody you would imagine I would have thanked, but I was really sincere about it. And I'll say, too, that my wife, Deb, who is someplace in the crowd here, and I could not be more pleased and honored to be back here at Chautauqua. We've been here a number of times over the past 25 years, since we first came here in the early 1990s on return from a time in Japan. And this is it's a special institution in American life and in world life. This is the last U.S. stop we're making before we move to London in a couple of weeks, where the Atlantic is opening up a new office there, and there could be no more American immersion than the one we're having here. So thank you for allowing us to join with you. I'm particularly pleased about the chance I have during this coming week to introduce and talk with a series of eminent lecturers led wonderfully by Michael Gerson about themes that could not be more important in our national life right now. These of values and ethics and faith and politics and public life and the role of the media in trying to connect all of these. And my role just today and through the days that follow will be to try to tie these talks together, to have an arc of each day's discussion, from the amphitheater lecture in the morning. How many people heard Jay Rosen this morning? I thought it was quite a great speech, I thought, and it was very relevant for setting up Michael Gerson's discussion. And then over the course of a week, I'll try also to see the ways in which our speakers differ, in which their views overlap, and so I'm really looking forward to this. And again, our goal by the end of the week will have been to try to look at the way that the resilient institutions in our society of the formal and informal institutions of governance, of the role of sort of the civic association that has been part of America's life and that Chautauqua was an important representative of back in the 19th century, the role of individual faith and organized religions, the role of the media, all of them in trying to buoy up our public life at a time when it seems under stress of many sorts. To start off this discussion, there could be no better person than Michael Gerson, whom you're going to start hearing from in just a few seconds, because he has deep personal involvement in all the different spheres that we're going to be talking about. I'm sure many of you know him as a columnist for the Washington Post and as a frequent commentator on TV and radio, so he's a working member of the media right now. Some of you may know that he has a very distinguished political background, too. He was President George W. Bush's chief speechwriter over a period of 6 years. He'd worked before that for Bob Dole and Dan Coates. He's involved in Republican politics, in what we could think of as classic Republican politics. And he also is a person of deep and connected to his work religious faith, that he is an evangelical Christian. He tries very hard and with success to connect the values that matter to him and his personal life and his religious life with the public presentations and analyses he makes. And I think there's been nobody more successful than Michael in trying to say, how do we cling to some kind of ethical standard at a time when politics is going in directions which one would not instantly call ethical at all times? Michael is from St. Louis. He's a man of the Midwest. His wife, Dawn, also from St. Louis, is here. And he's going to talk to us about the way we should think of these questions of institutions of governance, of the media, of values, of ethics, of faith, at a time when the 45th President of the United States is applying his versions of all those concepts. After Michael makes his speech, he and I will discuss for a while, and then by say 5 minutes to 3 at the latest, we'll open the floor to all of you from the questions, the microphones on each side of the stage. So with that, please join me in giving a sincere Chautauqua welcome to Michael Gerson.
That's really much appreciated, Jim. I'm grateful for your welcome, for the kind hospitality of the Hall of Missions. You really managed to make visitors feel very welcome. Given the pace and disturbing nature of recent history, I've struggled a bit knowing how to begin. It certainly puts the big eclipse next week in a different light. I've studied all the eschatological literature, and the darkening of the sun after the events of the last 9 months will be immediately followed by the arrival of 4 rather stern horsemen. We're meeting at a time of such tremendous consequence. So much is unprecedented. The poll numbers are the lowest in history for a new president, or as Trump puts it, the highest in history for a new president. It isn't really my intention today, however, to focus completely on Donald Trump. Some think I have become obsessed with him and are tired of it. My wife, who is here, gets the worst of it. She's now imposed a strict rule: for every mention of Trump, there is a $20 fine. And she's close to buying her Range Rover. My intention today is to shed some light on the trends beneath American politics in the age of Trump. But first, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. A few of you might have vaguely recognized me. The most common thing I hear in airports after I've made an appearance on Meet the Press or the PBS NewsHour, "Oh, you're that guy who is not David Brooks." I was a theology major at Wheaton College in Illinois, testing how my parents could pay the most money for the degree with the least earning potential. Now, with one of my sons in art school studying painting, my father has finally had his revenge. As many of you know, Wheaton is a pretty religiously conservative place. When I went there, the joke on campus was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. I somehow found my way. I worked on Capitol Hill in the media, including for Jim at U.S. News and World Report. Worked on 3 presidential campaigns. Had a wonderful period of government service as director of speechwriting and policy advisor to President George W. Bush in that brief historical window when there was a Republican administration that would actually employ me. Well, working on the global AIDS issue at the White House, I got to know the rock star Bono of U2 a little bit. He invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." I have also met Angelina Jolie. My wife was there too, I think. Or so she tells me. And I just have to mention this since I'm already dropping names. Not long ago, I was near the Tibetan border in northern India having a pleasant lunch with the Dalai Lama, honestly. As you know, some of his followers consider him divine, the 14th reincarnation of the Lord of Compassion. Though he did chuckle with our small group at one point telling us, "I am not a god." That is a sentence we'll never hear from Donald Trump. I think that was worth $20. Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, living under the tyranny of 2 deadlines a week. I'm a fellow at the One Campaign, an international grassroots organization founded by Bono and dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable disease. I will tell you, I normally hate internet clickbait. You know, the hot new phone everyone is talking about. Health insurance companies hate this new trick, or snoring is an indicator that you need to be euthanized. I made that last one up, but my wife would click on it. On the theory that if you can't beat them, surrender your integrity, I'm going to talk about 3 things, because I've truncated my remarks a bit, 3 things you should know about politics in the age of Trump. The list is not, of course, exhaustive, but I hope it's not random either. These are all trends that pre-existed Trump, but have culminated in our political moment. Taken together, they threaten deep divisions that may take generations to bridge. First, we live in a landslide country, just with different outcomes in different places. In the 2016 election, 80% of counties in America gave either Trump or Clinton a landslide victory. In the 1970s, that figure was more like 25%. Remember when Pauline Kael, actually the quote is fake news, supposedly said, "I can't believe Nixon won. I don't know anyone who voted for him." This is now quite plausible in large tracts of the country. We live in increasingly homogeneous political communities. Polarization is not just a function of Washington dysfunction. Americans are self-segregating in a variety of ways, politically, geographically, culturally, and our view of the opposing camp has become progressively more negative. Here's the conclusion of one recent Pew study that I want to read to you. Quote, "These days, Democrats and Republicans no longer stop at disagreeing with each other's ideas. Many in each party now deny the other's facts, disapprove of each other's lifestyles, avoid each other's neighborhoods, impugn each other's motives, doubt each other's patriotism, can't stomach each other's news sources, and bring different value systems to such core social institutions as religion, marriage, and parenthood. It's as if they belong not to rival parties, but to alien tribes. There are many reasons for this state of affairs, which would take a lecture series to explore. The ideological sorting of the parties is a powerful factor. In the 1980s, the share of Democratic votes from liberals was 26%. In 2012, it was 43%. The share of Republican votes from conservatives was 39% in 1980. In 2012, it was 60%. Conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans are increasingly endangered species, and this ideological divide between parties tends to turn every issue into a culture war battle. There are many other factors in polarization: the growth of partisan media, which provides not information but ammunition. There's the power of technology to mobilize factional interests and allow people to live in filter bubbles. There's gerrymandering, leading to the constant fear of politicians that they'll be primaried if they lack ideological purity. The result is the careful weaving of cocoons. One story illustrates this for me. David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report tells of meeting with a group of young Democrats in a wealthy suburban part of Northern Virginia. In the course of his presentation, he made reference to, quote, Cracker Barrel voters, those in counties with Cracker Barrel restaurants. Donald Trump won 75% of such counties. "Excuse me," interrupted one of the young liberals, "I think you have something wrong. Do you mean Crate and Barrel?" This is an extreme form of a cultural bubble, a life arranged by fate and choice so that other lives are unimaginable. When Americans start seeing their fellow citizens as enemies, a line is crossed. Our democratic institutions are designed for disagreement. They are undermined by mutual contempt. Unfortunately, the incitement of contempt can work politically, at least in the short term. We've seen this kind of leadership that fans frustration into fury. This kind of divisive politics has the chemical advantage of lighting up the limbic system, the powerful emotional center of the brain. If I remember my Psych 101 correctly, this portion of the brain includes the hypothalamus, which regulates the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. The politics of polarization can carry an election, but wreck a democracy. The largest problem with political tribalism is simple. When the other side is viewed as evil, then collaboration is not only hard, it is wrong. Compromise and comedy become not virtues, but vices. Bipartisan cooperation becomes an oxymoron, like a Mormon distillery or Presbyterian laughter. It's hard for people who care deeply about public events. It's hard for me, but resisting polarization must start with an adjustment in attitude. I want to borrow an idea from the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr. He says that the prophetic stance is to live, quote, on the edge of the inside. Prophets fully belong to a community, but they have just enough distance to see it with clear eyes. Quote, "To live on the edge of the inside," Rohr said, "is different from being an insider, a company man. Yes, you have learned the rules and you understand and honor the system as far as it goes, but you do not need to protect it, defend it, or promote it. It has served its initial and helpful function. You've learned the rules well enough to know how to break the rules without really breaking them at all, not to abolish the law, but to complete it, as Jesus rightly put it. A doorkeeper must love both the inside and the outside of his or her group and know how to move between these two loves." We should strive to be doorkeepers in our ideological traditions, committed but not blind to in our commitment, knowing both the inside and outside of our group and finding sympathy for both. So polarization is our first trend. My second point is related. No matter how good we think our case, we are not going to argue our way to unity. Social science has revealed something I find unsettling. The more knowledge that political partisans have, it turns out, the more stubborn they become in their beliefs. The largest problem is not so-called low-information voters. It is people who use their brain power to support the views of the tribe. So Republicans, for example, who have higher levels of scientific knowledge are actually more skeptical of global warming, even though the evidence for climate disruption by any objective standard is compelling. For evidence of this phenomenon, look no further than 10-year-olds playing soccer. When there is a close disputed penalty call, parents on the sidelines have a strong tendency to really believe in the call that favors their child's team. Or another, when social scientists showed aerial pictures of Trump's inaugural crowd and Obama's crowd, which was clearly bigger, to voters, many who supported Trump thought his crowd was bigger. They were not lying. They were demonstrating that group commitments often have more power than reason. Being confronted with uncomfortable facts actually makes one physically uncomfortable. According to researchers, there's a rush of adrenaline, a sensation of alarm, a sense of unbalance and chaos, feelings of nausea and anxiety. That actually sounds like falling in love, but it's the normal reaction to contradiction. Confirmation bias can not only be humorous but destructive. In a 2006 survey, a majority of Democrats agreed it was likely or somewhat likely that George W. Bush was complicit in the 9/11 attacks. In a 2015 poll, 46% of Republicans believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim. One gets the impression in both cases that partisans would have agreed with any polling description they perceived as negative, that Bush is a closet thespian, or that Obama is a notorious masticator. People seem eager to use any stick that comes to hand. How do we begin to confront this deep human tendency? I think it begins with being willing to call out your own side, to make fair judgments on the penalty call no matter who benefits. Calling out the other side really doesn't work. When Barack Obama criticizes conservatives or when Trump criticizes liberals, views are only entrenched. But it is different and powerful to police your own. Be an advocate, even be a partisan, but show some intellectual honesty. It has never been more important. I've met some politicians willing to do that. Take a look at Senator Jeff Flake's new book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which provides the first comprehensive critique of Trumpism by an elected Republican. And politicians like Senator Bob Dole, who I worked for, have a habit of calling it like it is, at least in the past. In 1996, I remember then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, had a 16% approval rating in the polls. At one event, he turned to Dole and asked, "Bob, why is it that people take such an instant dislike to me?" Dole replied, "Newt, because it saves them time." At least that's the way Dole tells it. He has a famously sharp tongue. I remember him saying that Al Gore was so stiff, his Secret Service code name was Al Gore. The hardest thing is to confront confirmation bias in ourselves. It would be difficult for me, to be honest, to praise good and important things accomplished by Donald Trump. I'll let you know if it ever happens. All of us have the tendency to see an enemy when we really need a mirror. We also seek an enemy when we need a certain kind of friend. For me, it has been important to have friends with different views than my own. It shows me that deep disagreements can also be honest disagreements, and it helps expose when I am guilty of groupthink. Here I'll borrow an idea from the Christian author C.S. Lewis. He talked of the need for what he called first friends and second friends. Quote, "The first friend," he said, "is the alter ego, the man who first reveals to you that you are not alone in the world by turning out beyond hope to share all your secret delights. But the second friend is the man who disagrees with you about everything. Of course, he shares your interest, otherwise he would not become your friend at all. But he has approached them all at a different angle. He has read all the right books, but he's got the wrong thing out of every one. And then you go at it, hammer and tong, far into the night, night after night, each learning to weigh the other's punches. Actually, though it never seems so at the time, you modify one another's thought. Out of this perpetual dogfight, a community of mind and a deep affection emerge. In this time of division, mistrust, and motivated reasoning, all of us could use more second friends. My third point and final point has some added urgency, given the events of the last few days. The destination of our divided politics, unless we turn aside, is dehumanization. There's life and death, the scriptures say, in the power of the tongue. Words can provide permission for prejudice. I have a friend at the University of Pennsylvania, a researcher named Emil Bruno, who has been studying the politics of Hungary. Emil has devised a disturbing scale to measure blatant dehumanization. In September of 2014, a sample of Hungarians was asked to place Muslim migrants somewhere on the familiar Ascent of Man scientific illustration, the one showing the gradual development from ape to Homo sapiens. Not long ago, the right-wing populist government stepped up its anti-immigrant rhetoric and built a barbed wire fence across the border to keep refugees out of the country. After this controversy, the same survey was conducted. The level of dehumanization in Hungary had doubled in just 1 year. He concluded, violent and dehumanizing rhetoric can increase support for violence among people already predisposed towards aggression. Here I cannot avoid the current moment, and I cannot avoid being blunt. We have just witnessed a hate march in Charlottesville that led to injury and death. But we have a president who refused to distinguish between the instigators and the dead. He could not bring himself to focus on the provocations of the side marching under a Nazi flag. I spent some time as a speechwriter, and this was rhetorical malpractice of the first order. There are many possible explanations, all of them disturbing. But there is no denying that Trump has used dehumanization. Refugees are, quote, animals. Mexican migrants are rapists. Muslims are threats as a political tool. And there is no denying that hateful political rhetoric can give sanction to bigotry. It acts as a psychological lubricant, says David Livington Smith, dissolving our ambitions and inflaming destructive passions. As such, it empowers us to perform acts that would, under normal circumstances, be unthinkable. If great words can heal and inspire, base words can corrupt. Trump has been delivering the poison of prejudice in small but increasing doses. In Charlottesville, the effect became fully evident, and the president has no intention of decisively repudiating his work. Nativism, of course, is not new to America. Illegal aliens have always caused problems in the United States. Just ask any Native American. The tendency to dehumanize has returned in our history again and again like an ugly rash, and it is always a test of our anthropology, our view of human beings, their rights and dignity, and of whom we welcome in the circle of our care. There are many sources of this commitment, but one of them is faith, a belief that human beings, all of them, the ones we like and the ones we resent, the ones we love, the ones we hate, are created in God's image. One of our greatest needs is a humane leadership that honors the intrinsic and equal value of lives. It is not impossible, we have seen it. In Lord Charnsworth's masterful 1916 biography of Abraham Lincoln, the author observes, quote, "Perhaps not many conquerors, and certainly few successful statesmen, have escaped the tendency of power to harden or at least narrow their human sympathies. But in this man, a natural wealth of tender compassion became richer and more tender, while in the stress of deadly conflict, he developed an astounding strength." The cause of moral leadership is not hopeless because words have the power of life, not just death. Yes, they can diminish, belittle, or deceive, or they can ring down the ages about human dignity. They can allow us for a moment to enter the experiences of others and widen just a bit the aperture of our understanding. And our nation is in desperate need of that kind of leadership again. All these trends, polarization, motivated reasoning, dehumanization, existed before the current president, but they seem to have culminated in our time. They've led to disagreements that are so much deeper than normal politics can repair. Americans have not just different party homes and different policy views, but different values. For liberals, there is equality, fairness, and inclusion. For conservatives, there is loyalty, patriotism, and moral purity. A political scientist named Rob Weiler calls this, quote, moral polarization. There are many structural reasons for political division, but there are no structural answers for moral polarization. The response here can only gather life by life and choice by choice. The answer will be spiritual, not in the sense of piety, but in the sense of mutual grace. There is really only one force that can overcome political polarization. It is empathy. It is the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of another, of a different party, of a different faith, of a different class. The failure of empathy is ultimately the failure of imagination. Individualism has been a great force for liberation in Western history. It is a great failure as a philosophy of life. The atomized individual is rootless and helpless and sometimes hostile, and there are signs of drift all around us. The rates of serious depression are at 20 to 30 times what they were 2 generations ago. In levels of suicide that take more lives each year than war, terrorism, and crime combined. In levels of drug abuse that strain our imagination. It is impossible to love our country without at least trying to love our neighbor. I've always appreciated the wisdom of G.K. Chesterton. Quote, the Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because generally they are the same people. We need a journalism like Jim practices that vividly describes worlds that are not our own and invites us to enter them in positive ways. We need a politics that calls us to the common good, not the triumph of our tribe. We need religious leaders who will emphasize the imago Dei, not the controversy of the day. But a calling comes to each of us. One of the greatest lessons of life and one of the deepest lessons of cultural change is the ability of compassion and generosity to break down even thick walls of contempt. When I met the Dalai Lama, he talked about the power of, quote, the undiplomatic smile to melt human barriers. There is the power of the kind word, the unexpected favor, the genuine compliment. This is the strange alchemy of empathy. We serve our principles best by loving people even more than our principles. This is not flabby or passive. At least it wasn't for Martin Luther King Jr. Love has within it redemptive power, he said. And there is a power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways at the beginning. They react with guilt and guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more in the transition period, but just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. End quote. Here is the redeeming value of our moment. Viruses create their own antibodies. We value more dearly what might be lost. We have had a taste of nihilism and chaos. We have looked into the abyss, and we know that cannot be our destination. I'm confident in the long run that people will choose decency and shared progress over the cruel pleasures of blame and spite, or so I try to believe. Like many of you, I'm frustrated with the direction of politics. I think a lot of us are in a Dick Tuck mood. Tuck lost a California Senate election in 1966. In his concession speech, he took to the stage and said, "The people have spoken, the bastards." It's in moments like this that the knowledge of history offers some consolation. In conclusion, we know that the heroes of America are heroes of unity, not division. Lincoln still inspires us because he could somehow purge hatred from his heart. Martin Luther King still leads us because he displayed the strength to love. These figures admitted no exceptions to our founding commitments. The American ideal is eroded when it is restricted. It is lost when it is hoarded. It is honored when it is shared. It is the great power of historical texts that they speak to us differently at different times. We read certain speeches and documents again and again, but then in a new context, in a new light, they speak across the years, as close as a voice over your shoulder. Last night, I was looking at George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, Rhode Island. You might remember that President Washington made a trip to Rhode Island in 1790 after it finally ratified the Constitution. Moses Sexius, the warden of the local Jewish congregation, was on the reception committee and read a letter thanking Washington for his service. Rhode Island had the country's largest Jewish community for a reason, because other states were not the best places to be Jewish or Quaker or Baptist or Catholic. 4 days later, Washington responded. "The citizens of the United States of America," he wrote, "have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and the immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent and natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." Washington concluded, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of its other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." This is the proper response to anger and division. We are not a nation that grants tolerance. We are a nation that recognizes inherent rights held equally by all the children of Abraham and everyone else. And when we come back to ourselves, as we always do, there shall be none to make them afraid. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. As I suggested, there could not have been a better way to start off this week's conversation than what we've just heard from Michael. There are so many specific things I'd like to ask you about, but I'm going to start with a meta point. So again, can you hear? Well, okay, so to myself, the reverb is quite loud, but okay, can you hear now? So again, this was a superb way to start off, Michael. Let me use this perhaps strange framing of your speech. You've just heard Michael speak to the shared interests and values of the entire American people at a time of strain and shock. And you will perhaps remember that 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, President George W. Bush gave what I thought was the best speech of his presidency, an address to the Congress that I assume you had a central role in, which had the same role of speaking to the long-term values of this nation and of all peoples in times of strain. And that was a very important thing for a president whom I personally disagreed with on most of his policies, to speak to all of America. You established that our current president was not able to do that after the strains, some of which he had engendered over the past year or so, and after the shock of the past weekend. In the absence of that voice coming from the person who is structurally the voice of the nation, the only person who can speak as the elected leader of the entire people, what is the way that this kind of message, a one like you have just delivered, can be produced by somebody in a position of political responsibility? Do we just assume there's going to be no such voice from the public, or what can we expect, what can other people do to send this kind of message?
Well, I want to agree with the premise here that presidential leadership under normal circumstances can matter greatly. I mean, a lot of things that we remember about Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt or even Ronald Reagan are the words, not the laws, not the legislation. And the presidency has a unique standing to speak for the soul of the nation, to express empathy, to express grief, shared grief. And so there was a tremendous loss here. The president didn't even seem to view this as an opportunity or a responsibility to speak for the whole nation, and instead really spoke for himself. So I think that it is a very difficult moment. I used my speech to some extent to make the point, which I think Jim has made better, that in the absence of that leadership at the center, it's going to require people and institutions across the country to play those roles, to play those healing roles. And some of that involves the calling of individuals. Some of it involves at the state level and the local level. I've seen a lot of liberals in America rediscovering the value of federalism, because it is possible to show real leadership. The governor of Virginia showed that kind of leadership. The mayor of Charlottesville showed that kind of leadership. So I think that you can really, there are other levels of government, but then there is beyond government entirely to the responsibility of individuals to stand for something better, not just to respond in kind. And I do that sometimes. It's a difficult thing. But to stand for something better and more transcendent in reaction to these kind of failures.
Michael and I had not discussed this issue before, the one we've just been mentioning, but given our shared background as one-time White House speechwriters, what struck me most also after what Mr. Trump did and did not do over the weekend was the role that presidents have seized at moments of surprise in national life and the difference that has made, whether it was President Bush, George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks, or Ronald Reagan after the Challenger disaster, or a long list of others. And I did a long article in the Atlantic site last night to a similar effect, though less eloquent, of what Michael was saying.
And President Obama after the school shooting, which...
Yeah, so both the Newtown and his Charleston speech. President Obama... Let's see. President Obama, I thought that the most effective speech of his entire presidency was the one he gave, the Amazing Grace speech in Charleston, where he ended up by singing. I thought that was So let me ask about another theme you advanced in this speech, which was the importance of being on the outside of the inside, of challenging yourself, challenging your tribe, not letting it become a tribe, challenging your premises. As most of you know, but perhaps not all, Michael Gerson has been an example of this over the past year, of trying to hold the current Republican Party, his Republican Party, and its current leaders to the standards that the Republican Party has stood for over the years, and he thinks conservatism has stood for. I imagine there are many people in this audience who are struggling with the same sort of challenge too. There are many people here who are traditionally Democrats and liberals. I'm sure there are many who are traditionally Republicans and conservatives and are struggling with how to reconcile the values that brought them to that side with the phenomenon that is before them right now. And what advice do you have? How do you stay engaged in politics and defend the values you've cared about? How do you not be a renegade or traitor or outcast? What has this been like for you as you've made this journey in the past year plus?
It hasn't been easy. First of all, as a conservative, to see a hostile takeover of my party in a way that was destructive to its future and destructive to the country. Also, as a religious person, to see religious leaders playing such often a role covering things they should not be covering with the president, really proving themselves to be hypocrites about some of the deepest values that religious people share. But what I try to do with friends, Republican friends, who have come to different conclusions about many of these things, is, first of all, to try your best not to question motives. My motives are mixed on a lot of things. And it's hard to read other people's motives when sometimes you can't even read your own in various issues. So I think that that's important. I think that, but I think that the dynamic that I have not had, and it's worth mentioning that much of the anger and resentment that helped elect Donald Trump is not without basis or merit. There are millions of people in America who feel like they have been left behind by the American economy and by the broader culture, which they think condescends towards them. And politicians understand this and they appeal to it. I think the president used that appeal in a destructive way to try to blame others and play a different kind of politics. But the reality is, from my perspective, that the Republican Party before Trump was not speaking to those needs at all. I attended to the 2012 Republican convention, the Romney convention, and listened to many of the speakers on the floor, and you would have thought that every single American was an entrepreneur. There was literally nothing said for wage workers during the entire convention. And so there was a gap that was filled here, a serious gap that has to be taken seriously. But the thing that I don't have as much patience for, though, is I will often get from other conservatives, harder core conservatives, you're betraying the team. We're in a battle. You have to support the general. You can't give aid and comfort to the other side. And first of all, as a writer, I can't think that way. I owe people my best judgment, and so I don't know how conservative writers adopt that kind of attitude. But it also makes politics pretty much impossible. If both sides accept this tribalism, and their goal is to control all the branches of government and to completely defeat the other side, there's almost no basis for compromise, no basis for civility, no basis for toleration. I think that to some extent, what we need, instead of thinking ourselves on teams, is the recovery of certain democratic virtues. We have a system that implies and requires a set of democratic virtues that allow us to work with one another in a pluralistic society. And I think that's where some of the recovery needs to take place.
I think I have time just to ask you two more questions before it will be everybody else's turn. One is a little more about evangelicals. You and I both worked for presidents whose religious awareness and identity was an important part of their political base and also their conduct of office. Jimmy Carter did very well in the South in 1976, in part because he was a born-again Christian and a Southerner and had strong Southern Baptist support. Right now, as you've pointed out, evangelicals are the strongest group now supporting Donald Trump. What is the tension within the evangelical community about this rock-solid support for a person who is the least visibly religious man to have held this office, and in normal circumstances they would find fault with?
I wish there was a little more division within evangelicalism. I think it's fair to say now that evangelicals are the base of the president's base. They're literally holding him up from political collapse in America with high levels of approval. And I would never have predicted that. A lot of evangelicals did not have him as their first choice in the primaries. I think it's fair to say that. But I think it's also fair to say that Trump, without intending it or planning it, fit a lot of the temptations of modern evangelicalism, took advantage of them, even in unconscious ways. But I won't go through the whole history, but evangelicals in the 19th century were much more optimistic and culturally engaged. They were the backbone of the abolition movement in America. And other movements of social reform, prison reform and reform of mental institutions. These were all identified with evangelicalism. But then there came a period in the 1920s and 1930s during the fundamentalist modernist controversy where evangelicals felt like they had been thrown down from the cultural heights and have an enormous chip on their shoulder, a feeling like they have been passed over and condescended towards. I think that Trump took advantage of this historical chip that they have on their shoulder. He also managed to use apocalyptic language that fit their worldview. He often talked about America going to hell or on the verge of an abyss, and that fit the pessimism of a lot of evangelical rhetoric. And he also appealed to evangelicals as an interest group, promising benefits for standing up for their rights, promising benefits like the repeal of the Johnson Amendment, dealing with them as though they were just another interest group. So all of these things are understandable from a political perspective. It's just that they have nothing to do with the Christian gospel, where the goal is to defend human dignity and to seek the common good. So there's a deep problem here when you take a faith that I value very deeply and identify it, publicly tie it and identify it to a philosophy of exclusion. That's a very serious thing. That's not just a change in the Republican Party. That's actually a much deeper and more disturbing shift.
One last quick question, and I think you'll be summoned to the microphones at that point. Here's a complementary hypothesis to your argument about American polarization. As you and I have discussed, my wife Deb and I have been traveling around small-town America for 4 years now, and our observation is if you ask people about national politics, you'll get this horrible, polarized, no middle ground dystopia that you've been describing. If you don't ask them about that, if you don't ask about Hillary or Trump or Ted Cruz or whatever, you'll find people still able to deal in very compatible and practical-minded ways. And indeed, something you mentioned about Hungary fits that, where you said that as they built the wall to keep out refugees, people had a worse stereotype of refugees. Our experience is the places with the heaviest proportion of immigrants and refugees in the U.S. are doing best in accommodating them and finding common purpose and viewing them as, and the build the wall champs are in New Hampshire or Minnesota or places of that sort. What is your brief response to that hypothesis that locally America is not riven in the way you're convincingly saying it is nationally?
Just to be fair to the facts, and I couldn't get to all of them, that extreme polarization has taken place on both edges of American political discourse. There are a huge amount of people, I think 60-some% of people, who say that they don't even talk about politics once a week. And these issues, when they turn to them, are distressing and distasteful, but they're living lives in a different realm, and different from the one that I live in. And even people who are polarized in their local communities are often better than their own rhetoric. I think that's true. And that's a source of hope. So, if you're talking about those sources of social healing, I think in the near term, a lot of that is going to have to be local. The only thing that just concerns me about that is this tendency over the last few decades of people to geographically polarize themselves, to live with like-minded people. That is a serious trend, and it makes it more difficult to imagine other lives.
And just I think that trend is more visible, say, in big metropolises than it is in sort of medium-sized cities where people still have to have some common life. But that's a discussion for another time. It is time to turn the questions over to you. So please approach the microphones. Yes, please, again.
Thank you for a fabulous talk. I think your hypothesis about empathy is that because regular people have less empathy for people who don't live and work like them, they're choosing leaders who have less empathy and compromise. How do we know that? How do we know it's not the training of leaders to be super competitive, winner take all, and that we have the empathy at the leadership level, that gap?
I actually put a lot of emphasis on empathy at the leadership level. If you look at, for example, the way in Ronald Reagan's rhetoric, the way he dealt with refugees. Refugees were viewed as people making tremendous sacrifices to achieve the American dream. They were, in speeches, they were always used as examples of the goodness of our country and the values of our country. And then you compare that to the way refugees have been viewed in these last year as a Trojan horse, as sources of threat. Including people from, I've spent some time in Jordan and Lebanon, and you meet Syrian refugees in particular who have lost everything, that it seems so deeply unfair. And I think that leadership has sunk down to some extent in the way that people view an issue like that. I think laws often reflect values. They don't have to reflect religion. There are values that come from many sources, but laws often reflect values. And public rhetoric often reflects values. And it helps shape a moral atmosphere in which we live our lives and raise our children. So I would put a lot of emphasis on the value of leaders. I mean, if we had leaders now who were explaining the contributions, the good side of immigration to our country, the economic necessity, the cultural richness, all of those things, we might have a different circumstance. My concern, though, if you're looking at structural reasons, is that there is, on the right in particular, there are a number of institutions that actually make their money by feeding partisan discontent on issues like immigration. That's true of PACs, but it's true of talk radio, and it's true of Fox News, and true of a lot of different settings. And so it's not just leaders who are filling this space. The media, partisan media in particular, is also playing a role in determining those values. I do trust ultimately in the basic decency of the American people when the right leader comes to the fore. We've just seen it again and again at the moment when we needed it. It's the reason that this is a hard moment to some extent, because that doesn't seem to have worked the way that it has often worked in American history. But I ended with a note of confidence that people will choose inclusion and empathy over the alternatives, but I think they do need to be rightly led.
So my intention in the time available till 3:15 will be going back and forth, and we'll get through as many as we can. Yes, sir.
Would you compare and contrast Rachel Maddow and Rush Limbaugh for us as representatives of the obviously liberal bias and conservative bias? And if neither of those is better than the other for their particular points of view, where should we go for best unbiased news?
After the Atlantic, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know Limbaugh better, and not that I know him personally, but Rush Limbaugh during the Reagan era was a very conventional, mainstream conservative on foreign policy, on domestic policy. The shift that has taken place has very much been in response to his audience. I think it's deeply cynical. And you know, I was told by a member of Congress, you know, we attempted to do comprehensive immigration reform during the Bush administration and got very, very close. But I was told by a member of Congress that the consultants that talk radio bring in to try to increase the number of listeners during that period told talk radio and Fox News that in order to multiply their numbers, they should ride the issue of immigration. And they did. And there is a benefit to a subset of people to do so. And I think I would very much put Limbaugh in that category. I mean, he is a kind of person that, you know, I'm friends with Mitch Daniels, who I really like. I like Jeb Bush. If they were to deviate just 1% from conservative orthodoxy, he would slam them, okay? But Trump deviates 70% from conservative orthodoxy. And it's a worshipful attitude. And I do think that there's something cynical and oriented towards income in all of this that I just don't think should be discounted. Rachel Maddow, I don't know well enough. I appear on MSNBC, but very seldom on her program. And so it's very hard for me to judge.
Yes, over here.
Well, you should be listening to the other side. That's just a little aside. You said you're supposed to get out of your bubble, right? Okay, my question, sorry to zap you. My question is this. Hillary won, despite what our press says, the overwhelming vote. But the Electoral College kept her from being president, and it is, of course, the legal means. But do you have some views on the Electoral College? Is it still pertinent? Is there any chance of getting it changed? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that I have a personal interest in the question, having participated in the 2000 election and won because of the Electoral College. So it's, I mean, it is the rules of the game. And I'm not sure, I think there's a question about what would be the ideal. I think there's no method by which we would get to that ideal. So I think you have to live with the system as it exists. We don't have a direct democracy when it comes to the presidency. And that was by constitutional design. Some of it was, by the way, to avoid the rise of demagogues. It didn't really work very well in this case. But this is something the founders also anticipated. So it isn't a fascinating political moment in a certain way. We're divided along so many cleavages. But Democrats have won the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections. Republicans need to understand that they are not in a good position when it comes to winning national elections. They're going to have to change their message, change their approach in a way that's going to give them majorities in the same way that Barack Obama won majorities. But the flip side there, and one reason it doesn't happen, is because the Republican Party is in better shape in states and localities than it has been in 100 years. And so the party at that level is so healthy that I think sometimes there's a complacency when it comes to the need for change and competition. I will just add here that Donald Trump's message appealed to a certain group that was more white and more elderly, but 1 in 4 kindergarten children in public school now is from a Hispanic background. There's literally no way that Republicans can ride any variant of the Southern strategy back to national influence. It's not possible in the long run. And they're going to need, if the goal is not just to win in the Electoral College, but to win majorities, they are going to have to find ways to appeal to the New America, the coalition of the ascendant. It was beaten in this last election. The Obama coalition, it turned out, needed Obama in order for it to work properly. But over time, since the 1970s, the presidential electorate has become less white by 2% every single election, every 4 years. In 2000, I'm trying to remember the exact figure, but we won the presidency with 56% of the white vote. In 2012, Mitt Romney lost the presidency with 59% of the white vote. So, these directions and trends are clear. So what I would hope, I think the energy that would go into constitutional reform on the Republican side might be better employed in finding a strategy that actually appeals to majorities in national elections.
I'm going to yield to myself 30 seconds on the Electoral College, then it will be your turn. So one reason why the Electoral College persists is that for most of our lifetimes in this room, it never made any difference. Until 2000, no living American had seen an election in which the Electoral College chose the victor. And if in the election after that, as I'm sure Michael knows, if 80 or 100,000 votes had gone the other way in Ohio, you would have had the reverse result favoring John Kerry. He would have won the Electoral College and the presidency, but lost the popular vote. Among the reasons to wish that might have happened is that then you'd have both parties thinking the Electoral College is not functional anymore. I'm in favor of the National Popular Vote Coalition. You can see it online, but now it's your turn.
Good afternoon. As I've watched the news over the last 2 years, I've come to notice that politics has failed us. And I think back to the 60s when the people went out to the streets to actually do something. And this was best shown in the protests in the airport for the Muslim ban. My question now is, how do we build off this empathy and the love and the compassion, et cetera, to something more practical? Because if we don't act very soon, other people are going to feel the brunt of this.
I think it's a serious and valid point. It's not enough just to say love your neighbor when you have a political breakdown. So I think that's very much the case. I wouldn't necessarily idealize the 1960s. It was also a period of deep national division, of political assassinations, several political assassinations. It seemed to people at the time that America was coming apart at the seams. But it does provide some examples of what moral leadership might look like. I don't know if you are familiar, but one of my favorite speeches of all time is Robert Kennedy speaking in Indianapolis on the night that Martin Luther King was killed. That was a situation where a lot of cities went up in flames that night. Robert Kennedy came out and informed the crowd, a gasping crowd, that King had been killed, and called for a lot of the values that I was talking about empathy and understanding, and saying that we have no future that along the lines of division. So I think the 1960s does provide some leadership examples on values, moral leadership examples on values that should inspire leaders today. I have a lot of respect for Robert Kennedy in this manner. He was responding to a time of chaos with the assertion of some of these democratic virtues that I was talking about. And I think that's necessary.
I'm going to suggest this. We have 4 people standing here who are waiting to ask questions. I'd like you each to give a brief version of your question, just one after the other, so they're all on the table, and Michael can use the remaining 90 seconds or whatever to answer them. Yes, so.
Yeah, I think I'm next. I believe I'm next.
Yes, go.
Okay, thank you. You made a statement about you saw Trump as the least religious of our presidents, which, if I take that logically, means that religion is the basis by which we then evaluate the moral basis of the president. Is it not, in fact, he's the most amoral of the presidents we've had? Then that religion should not be or cannot be the only status or the only evaluation by which we can then test the validity of any person that runs for a political office.
Good, thank you. Yes, over, yes?
Mr. Gerson, you offered a prediction, hopeful prediction of a return to our better nature. And my question is this, since the examples of McCarthyism in this country and Watergate and some other crises, our communications have changed drastically. Is there a danger in modern America that we lose the clinging to our better nature?
Good. Yes?
Okay. In terms of which areas of government might have the best strength to pull us more back towards a healthy democracy, how would you consider the executive branch, especially the presidency, versus the congressional, the judicial, and also state and local?
Thank you. And one more.
Your central suggestion was that we revert to empathy. And I can empathize with people who may worship different and have, therefore vote differently from me. But I really have a hard time generating empathy within myself for a wealthy person who just refuses to acknowledge shared factual reality. Can you suggest, sorry it's a therapy question and maybe you charge by the hour, but can you suggest a way to do that?
So, Michael, you have 2.5 minutes. Go.
I'll try to get to a couple of them. One of the hopeful things over the last year that we have seen in response to abuses by the executive branch, abuses of power by the executive branch, is that the checks are checking and the balances are balancing. The courts are playing their proper role. The Congress should do it more, but they have more recently. I don't know if you saw Senator Chuck Grassley sending the message that if you fire the Attorney General because you're trying to get at Miller, that there won't be any hearings this year on that. So they're pushing back. And it is a golden age of investigative journalism right now, and in a competition between the Washington Post and the New York Times in particular. They are breaking stories and holding people to account and getting information. And it's one of the sources of hope that I have is in this difficult and hard environment. A lot of institutions and individuals are beginning to step up. I think that needs to happen more within the Republican caucus is really the key here, but it's happening in a certain way that I mentioned. I certainly agree that moral leadership does not mean religious leadership. They're two separate things. I mean, there are many sources of the values, the democratic values that I'm talking about. Religion is one of those sources, but it is not the only one of those sources. And people come from very different perspectives and should be judged on that basis. But I do think the morality of our leaders does matter. I think we're seeing right now a lot of people that might have thought that those values of honesty and empathy and a concern for the common good, may not have been that important or that they were relative, are coming back and rediscovering their importance. With the idea I was getting at, talking about virtues creating or viruses creating their own antibodies. I think people are beginning to see the value of values when it comes to our common life.
I believe that the renewal of American democracy may very well begin at Chautauqua this week, and we're grateful to Jim Fallows and Michael Gerson for starting the conversation. Thank you both.